students, my name is Shreya. Today we are going to start a lecture series. It's going to be a 10-part series where we are going to discuss a brief history of English literature. Right? Now I've seen with a lot of students that what they tend to have a problem with is locating texts into various historical periods, right? And because historical periods or the various literary periods tend to give you a brief idea about how the texts in that era were written, you do have a great insight if you know the periods of the English literature, right? So in this lecture series, which is going to be a 10-part series, we are going to look at the periods not in great detail but in brief, so that you have a rough idea as to when and where should you place each text in, right? So today in this part we are going to talk about the Anglo-Saxon and the Anglo-Norman period, right? I'm sure you've heard these names, and if you go through any history of English literature, be it J. Long or be it the Rutledge the Rutledge book of history of English literature, Anglo-Saxon and Anglo-Norman periods are the periods where they start talking about English, right? So let's go on and see the Anglo-Saxon first, and then we'll move on to the Anglo-Norman period. So the Anglo-Saxon period can roughly be called to have taken place between 450 to 1050 AD, right? Now, this is also known as the period of Old English, right? We're just starting to write texts and poetry in English, right? There's hardly any prose, so we're just starting to write in English. This is the first time where English writing is starting, right? So there are some texts that you must know. There is the first one, which is Cadman's Hymn, right? It's often called the first fragment of literature. It's also known as first fragment of literature, right? And it does have a lot of religious elements. Now for Anglo-Saxon and Anglo-Norman, I wouldn't advise you to go through the texts in detail or anything like that, because these are texts that you would not be able to understand very easily because they're written in Old English, and secondly because the context has really changed a lot, and the way we read text today is very different, and the way we read text and the way the authors write text today is very different from how they were written, right? So there's no point going through these texts in detail. You won't be able to find too many information also about these, but it's important for you to know the names, right? The second one is Dior's Lament, right? And in the individual who's the subject of the text is talking about the day-to-day trials of life, right? And this also has a repeated chorus, which is the evil has ended, so also may this, right? So this is the next one. The text is known as Dior's Lament. So we've done two texts from the Anglo-Saxon period. The first one being the Cadman's Hymn, and the second one is the Dior's Lament, right? Now moving on to the third one. The third text is known as the Seafarer, right? Which talks of the hardships of ocean life. Now, if we go back to the previous slide and see Dior's Lament, that was also talking about realities of everyday life. And so does Seafarer, where hardships of ocean life are discussed. But there is also the religious element, where they are trying to establish that all our souls at the end belong to God, right? So there is always a religious element or two in all your texts. So even in Cadman's Hymn there was a religious element, in Dior's Lament also there is a religious element, and so is there in Seafarer, right? Religious elements are strong in this age, which is the Anglo-Saxon period, or also known as the Old English period, right? The next one, it's an important text. It's an epic poetry. Text is called Beowulf, right? Epic poetry. Little bit about this you must know, little bit detail about this one, right? It has alliterative lines, right? So for Anglo-Saxon period, I would also want you to know that a lot of texts were written in alliterative lines, right? There was a lot of alliteration that was happening in these lines. What is alliteration? Alliteration is when in a certain line there are similar sounding words that are placed together, right? So there was a lot of alliteration that was used, right? Now in Beowulf there are two. Beowulf is a classic hero, and so this is epic poetry. It's epic in scale, it's epic in form, it's epic in content, right? So Beowulf is a classic hero who kills two devils, right? So there are two devils. There's Grendel, and the second monster is Grendel's mother, right? So both these monsters are killed in the text, right? So these are some of your important texts that are associated with the Anglo-Saxon period. Anglo-Saxon period is the period where it was in an Old English period. And what are the Germanic tribes that are associated with the Anglo-Saxons? The tribes that are associated are Jutes, Saxons, and Anglos, right? So Jutes, Saxon, and Angles, right? So these are the three Germanic tribes that are associated with the Anglo-Saxon period. More or less, this is what you should know. The fact that there were alliterative lines, the fact that the Germanic tribes that dominated the Anglo-Saxon period are Jutes, Saxons, and Angles, the fact that this period is also known as the Old English period, the fact that not too many authors were coming out and saying that this is my text, right? So, and in that series, some of the important texts. The first epic poem that we know here is Beowulf. There are two monsters, there's Grendel and there's Grendel's mother. It is written in alliterative lines. Then the fact about Cadmum's hymn, where this is also believed to be the first fragment of literature, right? So moving on from here to the set of people who were acclaimed authors. So to the set of people who did come out and say, okay, this is my text and this is what I've written, right? So few authors that we know of. Initially you did the works that we know of, right? And which is not attributed to a particular author, for instance. Or we are attributing it to the author, but we are not sure if the author has actually written it. Based on the writing style, we've often attributed texts to various authors, right? But here are a set of people who've come out and said, okay, this is what I've written, right? So there's Bede, who's also known as the Vulnerable Bede, right? Also known as the father of English learning. Right? And the text, very important text is Ecclesiastical History of the English People that is written. Right? This is an important text that's written by, right? So moving on then to the second one. The second one is Cinewulf. Right? And he's the first person. So the author reader relationship that you understand now, where the author signs a book or the author puts his name or her name on the book and the reader recognizes the text through the author, right? So this equation between the reader and the author, it's the first time where any author is actually signing his own texts, right? So he's the first one who signed his own texts. And what are the texts that he's actually signed are the ones which are called, there's one that is called the Christ, and then there's another one which is called Eileen, right? So these are the two texts which he's actually signed. But there are some texts which are attributed to him based on his writing styles, right? So the Dream of the Rood. Like I said, if you look up any of your history of English literature, Dream of the Rood is a text that's often been talked of, right? And Dream of the Rood is a text that is attributed to Cinewulf. But some texts he's actually signed. So what are the texts that he's actually signed? There's Christ and there's Eileen, right? Now Christ is divided into three parts. There is Nativity, there is Ascension, and there is Doomsday, right? So there's Nativity, there is Ascension, and there's Doomsday. Right? So these are the three parts of the text that he's written. The Christ. Now the Dream of the Rood is also a text that's attributed to him, and the Rood stands for a cross. So it's also a tale of redemption, tale of suffering and redemption. right? So these are some of his important texts and some of the important themes in these texts, right? Moving on then, there's Alfred. So this becomes the third person that we're going to discuss, right? Now this person is believed to be the first prose writer, right? And he's much more known as a translator than a writer, right? And an important text that he's translated is called Saxon Chronicle, right? And Saxon Chronicle also becomes an important source for further authors to take it up and start writing historical accounts of the same, right? Okay, so this sort of finishes up your Anglo-Saxon period, and in no ways does it justify whatever the Anglo-Saxon period was about, but it's a brief idea as to the kind of texts that were written, how the texts were nameless, how the text had always had religious elements, what was the era between which the Anglo-Saxon period was operating, why is it called the Old English period, what are the kind of Germanic tribes that are dominating, what is the writing form, right? So then moving on to the Anglo-Norman period. Now your Anglo-Norman period is a shorter span of time, right? It's attributed to have existed between 1066 to 1350 AD, right? So this is a shorter span of time where the Anglo-Norman period is believed to have lasted only for about 300 years, whereas the Anglo-Saxon period has lasted for about 600 years, like I told you, between 450 AD to 1050 AD. Now Anglo-Saxon period started with the Anglo-Norman period started with the Anglo-Norman Conquest, right? So the Anglo-Norman Conquest was in 1066 AD, and it's an important event. Why? Because it brought in a new language that changed Old English to Middle English, right? And what is this language? It's the French language, right? So French, a lot of French words were used in cooking, right? A lot of French words that the English vocabulary still has, is from, all these words are taken from the French language, right? So it changed the way language was working, right? It brought in a huge change in language, and the language from Old English became Middle English, right? So now there are some important people here also, and here now the time has come where people have actually started naming their texts, right? So the authors have started naming their texts, not to a great extent, but still there is some evidence that shows us that the authors have started naming their text, right? So here in this series there is Geoffrey of Monmouth, right? Now this one is not actually this one's not important for the work he's written. So right, he's not important as a writer, but he's important as a history chronicle. His works are important as a history chronicle, right? And a lot of his works become a source for future authors, right? So a lot of Shakespeare has been taken from from Monmouth's texts, right? A lot of Shakespearean plays have been taken from here, right? Right. So the name of the text that Geoffrey of Monmouth has written is known as Historia Regum Britanniae, right? So this is the text, and it's a very important text that he's written, and this is the text that counts for his understanding. This is the text that counts for future authors' understanding of history, right? So it's an important figure. It's Geoffrey of Monmouth, right? So he's an important figure here. Then there is the second one, who is Layman, right? His name is spelled in various ways in various texts, so you can look into it, right? So the text he's written is Brute, right? The text it's also known as Layman's Brute, right? And the text is also known as the name of the text is also the Chronicle of Britain, right? and it's a rhyming chronicle. Yeah, so remember that also, right? So, and layman, as a matter of fact, layman is the first person who's given the story of King Arthur and his knights, right? So Thomas Mallory's Morte Arthur, the first person to bring out King Arthur and his knights is layman, right? Now again, like I was talking about Arthurian romances, so this is the era that a lot of Arthurian romances are seen, right? A lot of these romances are brought into picture. A lot of these romances are being written about, right? Important one in this series is Sir Gawain. Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, right? This is an important one. This is one of the first important texts that have the Arthurian romance in the way we understand it today. And although we don't know who's written it, the text is attributed to the individual who started being called the Gawain poet, right? So the text became so popular and the text was so acknowledged that the poet who's written it, because we don't know the name of the poet, because it was not a very common, like I said, people have started coming out with their text, people have started naming it, but it's still not a very common ritual for people to tell the text that they've written. So the text, because we don't know who the author of Sir Gawain and the Green Knight is, it's often the text is attributed to a person who we call the Gawain poet, right? So now these are some of your facts, important facts about the Anglo-Norman and the Anglo-Saxon period, Anglo-Saxon and the Anglo-Norman period in that order. So the Anglo-Saxon period, which is the Old English period, to the Anglo-Norman period, where it's a beginning, in a way it's a beginning of the Middle English period, right? So now that, right? So now with this we end the Anglo-Norman and Anglo-Saxon and Anglo-Norman period, and again I'll say in that order, don't confuse yourself like I am, right? So with this we can complete the two periods. Hence on, we are going to look at the age of Chaucer and all the contemporaries that were writing along with Chaucer, and then move on to Renaissance and so forth and black, right? So then, if you think that this was helpful, if you think that there are things that we can improve upon, if you think that this was something that that is going to help you for your exams, then you must subscribe to the channel and look forward to the series of lectures that are going to follow. For every lecture, I'm going to try and put the previous lecture series, so I'm going to part it and then put it together in a compiled fashion, right? So whenever you're trying to start, history of English literature is always a good point to start understanding and start your analysis and reading of British literature, right? Because then it gives you a brief layout of everything that's happened, and then you can easily place your text in the era, like I was saying in the beginning, right? So we'll put those, and subscribe to the channel if you think this was fruitful. If there are any suggestions, if there is anything that you want me to change, or if there's anything that you want me to improve upon, you can always comment, right? Thank you.